Hello, folks. Mr. Robot here. Today we are talking about Hollow Earth and the mythological stories around a city that exists, or an empire that exists inside the Earth, called Agartha, also known in other texts as Shambhala. Some say that these two are related or are the same thing. But the first thing I do when I research a topic like this, I'll get a general sort of understanding from Wikipedia. Here we can see it is a legendary kingdom that is said to be located on the inner surface of the Earth. It is sometimes related to the belief in a hollow Earth and is a popular subject in esotericism. And these stories go back way into like the 17 and 1800s.
The Agarian alien race, as they're called, were, to find a better way to describe them, were an offshoot of humanity that originally dwelled on the surface of the Earth in the ancient Atlantean and Lemurian empires.
Garcians, or the Argarians, were a group of Asiatic, possibly Nordic humans. I have heard from a few sources that they were 12-foot tall humans who, a lot of sources claim, discovered a vast system of caverns below the regions of the Gobi Desert and the surrounding areas thousands of years ago. Now, the most interesting part about this that I've caught on to, and I've seen it mentioned in almost every video, almost every article when it comes to these caverns, is the fact that they discover, meaning that these caverns existed before they were even there. So the one question that I have is, who created these caverns? Now, these are vast systems of caverns too, so they stretch all over the planet from what I've heard.
With the caverns, it appears to me at least that they were naturally occurring, but that was maybe not necessarily artificially created by an earlier race. But then again, it's hard to say. So another thing I need to do research into moving forward is whether the caverns that were discovered by the ancient Atlanteans and Lemurians, which they fled into during the aftermath of their war, were naturally occurring or artificially created, and if they were artificially created, then by whom?
The three continents, was actually the Lemurians, then you had the Atlanteans, but then there was Mu, which also sank. And this was, according to what I've found out, it was supposed to have happened about 12,000 years ago. So they do have a time period on it. But
Yes.
that's the area with India. I was told that they did go down into the underground caverns because of a conflict that did take place between Lemuria and Atlantis.
I realized this when I was sort of researching ancient stories from New Zealand and stuff like this. I realized the word for Maori in the South African language, Afrikaans, is Maori. And it's sort of, the mu sound is actually the ancient word for Lemuria, the mu in Lemuria, because it wasn't always known as Lemuria, only later on, but before that it was known as mu, right? You can see Australia here, you can see New Zealand down here, right? But you can see before the flood, all of this, Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, New Caledonia, Solomon Islands, all of this was above ground, above the water, and this was one big continent, the same sort of shape as South America, but just smaller. You can see this point fit into this Chile, Bolivia, Peru area, okay, as the continents kind of shifted. And when the flood happened, you can see the tsunami came from this direction and hit it here, and it washed out here, and then it hit Australia, and that's what created the Simpson Desert in the middle of Australia, and it's also what created the Great Australian Bight at the bottom here. You can see the land mass is sunken down here as well as the bottom of Tasmania was also connected to Australia, okay? Now, the question I have is whether that happened in the 12,000 BC cataclysm or the previous cataclysm that happened in the previous age, which was 49,000 BC.
And then in the aftermath of a great war between Atlantis and Lemuria, they went underground, or during and in the aftermath of the war, they went underground as a result of said war. And they built an entirely separate civilization underground and in the hollow earth, which is where they're supposed to live still to this day. And some say their world underneath there is lit by a smoky central sun, whose origins I currently need to do more research and to find out whether that sun was something that was always there or whether their technology was advanced enough to have perhaps artificially created a star. So that's another thing I need to look into. Various civilizations have mentioned the Hollow Earth. The Hopis mentioned it in their creation story and in their prophecy story. It was referenced in ancient India as well. So that's something I'm going to need to do a little bit more research in. I also need to do more research to find out maybe how aware of us surface dwellers they are, because there were some, according to the Hopi Indians, that came up from the earth in the aftermath of the war and the natural disasters it created. And then some of them started rebuilding here on Earth. So us surface dwellers are perhaps related to different the group of people that came back up, but we're also related to the underworld dwellers, or the Agarians as we call them. And that's the most interesting thing about this race of aliens as compared to the other races, is they're human just like us. And there's also a possibility the Atlantean and Lemurian peoples that existed prior to this war I just mentioned came from other planets. So perhaps humans are not native to Earth to begin with, which opens a whole nother can of worms, as far as our history is concerned and all that. Research that I've done so far appears to lead to, over and over again, that was the cause of them fleeing underground, and that offshoot of humanity never came back up. According to the Hopis, some of them did, and were descended from us surface dwellers are descended from them today. So there's two offshoots of humanity with two separate histories. That's kind of my understanding of it. Now, how aware they are of us, I don't know. We're kind of dimly aware of them. There's a lot of people that don't know anything about them whatsoever, so it's not like universally understood or discussed up here among all of us 6 billion surface dwellers. I don't know how aware they are of this, though. They may be, if they're more advanced, they may be universally aware, but it's impossible to say.
Now, it's said that this New Zealand area was Lemuria, and Atlantis existed in the Atlantic Ocean between Central America and Africa, Mediterranean. And Plato says that Atlantis was an empire that stretched from southern United States to Mexico to Bolivia and across to all the way to Lebanon and sort of like it's, you know, the bottom of Europe as well. And so it was a huge empire, right? And they would have been fighting in this direction here to here. And it's interesting because there are ancient myths in Peru that speak about ancient chiefs that went sailing or that took canoes out into the Pacific and actually reached Australia or some other landmass in that direction. And there's also Aboriginal myths in Australia that speaks about coming in contact with people coming over the sea from this direction. So, and it's also interesting that New Zealand has all this ancient mythology that's very similar to Hawaii. Now, remember in that book we read before, they spoke about Hawaii also being part of like this Agarthan kingdom, right? So yeah, it's interesting how a lot of these ancient myths from completely different sources, completely different areas of the world, all sort of coalesce and form this grand story that we're just sort of scratching the surface of, you know. The thing that I find the most fascinating is that the geology and the science also is starting to back this up, which just leads tantalizingly closer to this ancient mythology actually being true history. So yeah, I'd love to gather all these ancient sources and investigate it more with this lens of understanding that it's actually history. Especially, I would like to read more of the Hindu and Buddhist stories about it, because they go into so much detail that you just never knew about, because only a fraction of the texts have been sort of translated from Sanskrit, you know. So there's just so much more to uncover. It's great.
Now, with that conflict, I know that the Atlanteans were being manipulated by the Anunnaki. Now, with that going on, there was a conflict that took place that escalated to supposedly a nuclear attacks that eventually caused both Lemuria and Atlantis to sink into the sea, causing the Lemurians to go underground. That's what I've heard. I also heard that the Atlanteans wanted to go underground with them, but they eventually ended up traveling across the planet above ground and exploring different places to settle. And that's probably where a lot of the things concerning Egypt and places of that nature happen.